I want to tell you a love story. It's set in the Appalachian Mountains long enough ago that most of the customs from the old country still survived. It's about a young man named Sean who was tall and strong and downright handsome. And he had just turned 19 years old, which in that time and place meant that it was time for him to find himself a wife. But that was easier said than done because, like most folks in that part of the world, Sean and his father lived far away from everybody else. No neighbors. Sean had quit school years ago to work with his father, and they hadn't been to church since his mother died. So the opportunities for Sean to meet women was literally few and far between. But there were weekly barn dances that attracted every young man and every young woman for miles around. And Sean went to those dances. And he hung out with the other young men outside, laughing and joking and getting a few shots of courage from jugs of homemade moonshine. And they would brag about which girls they were going to dance with. And they would continue to brag after they went into the barn. They continued to brag until the girls arrived. And when they came in giggling and smiling and throwing come hither looks, it suddenly got very quiet on the men's side of the barn. But then the dance started, the music started, and a few of the braver men would walk across the dance floor and ask young women to dance with them. But not Sean. Sean was shy, he had very little experience with women, and he went outside and got another shot of courage. And when he came back into the barn, that's when he saw her. Perhaps the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Long hair the color of corn silk, flashing green eyes, and perfect red lips. He could see that she had long, shapely legs. And, well, let's just say she was shapely all over. And so Sean screwed up his courage and made that long, lonely walk across the dance floor and asked her if she'd like to dance. And she said, I suppose so. And so they danced. And Sean quickly found that she didn't talk much. He did manage to find out that her name was Gloria. And they danced a few more times. And at the end of the evening, Sean asked that all important question. He asked if he could see her again. And she said, I suppose so. And so the courtship had started. And Sean saw Gloria a few more times, and she didn't get any easier to talk to, but she also didn't get any less gorgeous. And so he finally decided, he knew that it was now time that custom said if he didn't invite her home to meet his family, the romance would be over. And so he said to her, Gloria, would you like to meet my father? And she said, I suppose so. And so when the appointed day came, Gloria and Sean went to the house where his father lived. His father was sitting in his usual spot on the porch swing. He invited Gloria to sit beside him. They talked for a while. And then he looked at Sean and said, Sean, fetch me that rock from the garden. Sean couldn't believe his ears. He knew exactly what rock his father was talking about. It was huge. It was half buried in the soil, and it had been there for as long as Sean could remember. He didn't think he had a chance of moving that rock, but he also knew better than to argue with his father. So he hopped into the garden, wrapped his arms around that rock, and started tugging. And he tugged and he tugged and he tugged till he thought his arms were going to fall off, and the rock didn't budge. And then he heard his father say to Gloria, you think that's the kind of man you want to marry? And Gloria said, I don't suppose so. And got up and started walking home by herself. And there was something about the wiggle in her walk as Sean watched her leave that made him know he was never going to forgive his father for what he'd just done to him. But he also knew that it was going to be a long time before he ever brought a girl home to meet his father. And in the meantime, he decided he would beef up a little bit more. And so he did everything he could. He lifted hay bales, he lifted heavy sacks of feed, and in his spare time, he went out into the fields and he picked up rocks that he was sure weighed as much as the one in the garden. He kept going to the barn dances, but he didn't ask people to dance. He just drank and talked with the other men. And then one night, he saw a girl he thought might be worth the risk. She wasn't nearly as voluptuous as Gloria, but she looked friendly, less haughty. She was pretty enough, and her eyes were as dark as her hair. And so Sean walked across, introduced himself, and said, "Would you like to dance?" And she said, "I'd like that." And as they danced, Sean found her easy to talk to. He found out her name was Bella. And by the end of the evening, he was sure that he wanted to see her again. And so he asked, "Can I see you again?" And she said, "I'd like that." And so Sean saw Bella regularly for several months. And the more he saw of her, the better he liked her. But he wasn't anxious to let her meet his father. But then it got to the point where he knew that if he didn't ask her, it was going to be rude. And so he said, "Bella, would you like to meet my father?" And Bella said, "I'd like that." And so, once again, Sean took a young woman to meet his father, who was sitting in his usual place on the swing on the porch. They chit-chatted for a while, and then Sean heard the question he knew he was going to hear. "Sean, can you bring us that rock from the garden?" Well, Sean thought he was ready, and he hopped down, went to the garden, wrapped his arms around that rock, and strained as hard as he could, and the rock did not budge. And then Sean heard his father say to Bella, "Is that the kind of man you want to marry?" And she said, "I don't think I'd like that." And she too got up and walked away. And as Sean watched her disappear, he swore to himself that he would never bring another girl to meet his father, even if it meant he never got married. And for weeks after that, he didn't even go to the barn dances. But his friends kept saying to him, "Come on, Sean, you don't have to dance. Just come, have a few drinks, tell a few jokes, get a few laughs. You don't have to ask anybody to dance." And so that's what Sean did. And after doing that for a couple of weeks, one night at the barn dance, he heard a sound like he had never heard before. It was a laugh. And it wasn't a girlish giggle. It was a deep-throated, gay laugh. And as he looked across the dance floor, it was easy to spot who it was because she stood out, not just for her laugh, but for her flaming red hair and her freckles. She had more freckles than Sean had ever seen. And she wasn't what you would call beautiful, but she was pretty. And she just had a spirit that was contagious. And then she must have known Sean was looking at her because she looked across the dance floor and she smiled. And he smiled back. And then she made a tentative step out onto the dance floor. And Sean thought, uh-oh, I can't let her do that. She's made the first move. I can't embarrass her by not going over. So he went over and he asked her, he introduced himself and found out her name was Reba. And he asked her if she'd like to dance. And she gave him a big smile and said, "I would love to." And so they danced, and they danced together all night. And at the end of the evening, when the dance was over, Sean, of course, asked her if he could see her again. And she said, I would love that. And so they kept talking and seeing each other. And finally, Sean knew this was a woman he wanted to marry, but he also knew that he did not want to take her home to meet his father. And he put it off as long as he could. And then one day, she again made the first move. She said, Sean, I would love to meet your father. And so he took her. He had no choice. And on the given day, they went to see his father, and the routine was the same. They sat for a while, made small talk, and then his father said, Sean, fetch me the rock from the garden. And Sean did what he knew he had to do. He didn't have much hope for success, but he hopped down there, he wrapped his arms around the stone, and he struggled and he struggled and he struggled, and it just wasn't moving. And just before he could quit, a shadow came across, and two freckled arms reached around the stone and touched him. And that voice that he knew said, I would love to help you do this. And so together they rocked and rocked and rocked the rock, but it wouldn't move. And finally, after not too long a time, they decided it didn't matter. And they just laughed and leaned against that rock, laughing and holding hands. And Sean looked at his father, and his father looked down at him and said, that, my son, is the kind of girl you want to marry. And marry her he did. And of course, they lived happily ever after.